Welcome to Life Stories, where we dive into powerful and inspiring narratives that remind us of the strength in standing up for what's right. Today's story follows Grace Anderson, a 16-year-old girl who finds herself caught in a moment of unfair judgment, where prejudice threatens to undermine her sense of self. But through grace, resilience, and the support of her father, she stands tall, proving that dignity and respect cannot be stripped away. Join us as we explore the profound lessons of empathy, fairness, and standing firm in the face of adversity. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story. It was a late afternoon in Beverly Hills, and the boutique where Grace Anderson had walked into was a haven of elegance and luxury. The sunlight filtered through the glass windows, casting soft, golden rays onto racks of high-end dresses that hung like delicate pieces of art. Grace was excited. She had been eyeing this particular boutique for months, dreaming of one day stepping inside, feeling the fabrics that were unlike anything she had ever touched before. Today was the day. Her heart raced with the thrill of it, the excitement of experiencing something so grown up, so sophisticated. Grace was 16, tall, confident, and with an innate love for fashion that had been with her since she was a little girl. She loved the feel of expensive fabrics between her fingers and the idea of having something so beautiful, something that could reflect her own sense of identity. She wasn't used to places like this. She wasn't the kind of girl who spent her time in posh boutiques, but her father, David Anderson, had often told her that she could visit any store she liked, as long as she was respectful and understood the value of what she was buying. This was her moment to prove that she could be independent, to take that step on her own. She didn't need anyone holding her hand. She was here for herself. She smiled as she walked into the boutique, a feeling of independence washing over her as the door softly chimed behind her. The store was quiet, serene, with only a few other customers browsing, lost in their own worlds. Grace's heart fluttered with excitement as she walked through the aisles of shimmering gowns. The store, though familiar in its luxurious design, was a world apart from the one she had grown up in. Grace wasn't just here to shop. She was looking for the perfect dress for an upcoming charity gala her father was hosting. It was a big event, one where people from the city's elite would gather to raise funds for various causes. She had always admired how her father handled these events with grace and ease, making connections while never compromising on his values. Grace wanted to be a part of that world, not as someone who was simply there to attend, but as someone who belonged. As she moved deeper into the store, she found herself lost in the intricate details of the fabrics, the colors that seemed to dance under the lights. She ran her fingers across the velvet of one dress, marveling at how soft it felt against her skin. It was a deep emerald green, the perfect color for the gala. Grace immediately knew she had to try it on. But as she looked at the size, her heart sank. It wasn't her size. She placed the dress back on the rack with a small sigh. Little did she know, the moment she dropped the dress, a pair of eyes were watching her from across the room. Evelyn Davis, a woman who carried herself with the unmistakable air of entitlement, had been observing Grace since the moment she entered. Evelyn was a regular at the boutique, a woman who prided herself on knowing every corner of this place, from the designers to the salespeople. She looked at Grace with an expression of disapproval, her lips curling into a thin, judgmental line. Evelyn was the kind of person who believed that certain places were meant for people like her. She had made a name for herself in the city, attending charity galas, rubbing shoulders with influential people, and gaining access to the best things life had to offer. Evelyn believed that the world was divided into those who deserved to be in places like this, and those who didn't. And, in her mind, Grace didn't belong. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she watched Grace wander around the boutique, her judgment growing with each passing minute. To Evelyn, Grace wasn't just out of place, she was an intruder in a space that, in her opinion, was meant for people of a certain class. Grace, with her youthful exuberance and a look of naivety about her, wasn't part of that world. Evelyn watched, her gaze sharp and calculating, as Grace picked up another dress, a dress that, to Evelyn's trained eye, she likely couldn't afford. What's she doing here? Evelyn muttered under her breath, loud enough for the few other customers nearby to hear. Grace continued to browse, oblivious to the attention she was drawing. To her, this was just a boutique, just another opportunity to find the perfect dress for her father's event. But to Evelyn, this was a challenge to the status quo. She couldn't let it slide. Someone needed to put Grace in her place. Evelyn followed Grace through the boutique, her steps almost silent but determined. When Grace stepped into the fitting room, Evelyn muttered something under her breath again, just loud enough for the other customers to catch. "I bet she's not even here to buy anything," she sneered. Grace heard the comment but, in her youthful innocence, chose to ignore it. She wasn't there to make enemies or to prove anything to anyone. She was there for herself. To shop. To feel the thrill of independence. Yet, little did she know, the storm was already gathering around her. As she tried on another dress, a gorgeous blue number that shimmered like the ocean, she felt a rush of happiness. This was it. This was the one. She admired herself in the mirror, imagining the upcoming event and the way she would glide across the ballroom floor, proud of herself for finding the perfect dress. But as Grace looked at herself in the mirror, the sound of Evelyn's voice sliced through the air like a cold wind. "That dress is beautiful," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But are you sure you're in the right store?" she asked, her fake smile barely concealing the disdain she felt. Grace, confused by the question, frowned. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied, her voice steady, though her heart began to race. She didn't understand what was happening, why Evelyn was speaking to her this way. But she wasn't about to let anyone intimidate her. Not today. Evelyn's smile faltered, replaced by a sneer. "This store isn't exactly budget-friendly," she said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "Maybe you should try somewhere more affordable." Grace's stomach tightened. She had faced rudeness before, but something about this felt different, more targeted, more cruel. But still, she didn't back down. "I'll let my purchases speak for themselves," she said firmly, refusing to let Evelyn's words shake her. The murmurs from the other customers began to grow, their whispers filling the air as they watched the exchange unfold. Grace remained composed, looking around and noticing the store manager standing off to the side, watching the interaction. With a deep breath, Grace spoke again, her voice calm but firm. "If you have an issue, maybe you should take it up with someone in charge." Evelyn smirked. "Oh, don't worry. I will," she said, turning her attention to the store manager, her voice sharp and insistent. And so, it began, the confrontation that would change everything. Evelyn wasn't satisfied with simply criticizing Grace, she was determined to escalate the situation, to make her presence known in a way that would embarrass and humiliate Grace in front of everyone. The manager, clearly uncomfortable, approached with caution. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice loud and filled with authority. "I've been watching this girl, and I'm pretty sure she slipped something into her bag." The words hung in the air, sharp and accusatory, and Grace's heart sank as she realized what was happening. Grace stood there, stunned. The accusation came so suddenly, so cruelly, that it took her a moment to even process what was being said. "I've been watching that girl." Evelyn's voice echoed across the boutique, laced with suspicion and malice. "And I'm pretty sure she slipped something into her bag." The words hung in the air, sharp and biting. Grace felt her stomach drop, her pulse quicken. She was used to the odd rude comment, the occasional glance. But this was something else. This was an accusation that cut straight to the core of who she was as a person, undermining her entire character. And worse still, it was happening in front of a room full of strangers. who were now staring at her, waiting for the manager to take action. Grace's mind raced as the manager, a young woman who had only been working at the boutique for a few months, hesitated. She looked at Evelyn, then at Grace, clearly unsure of what to do. The manager's gaze flickered nervously between the two women, not wanting to take sides but equally unwilling to ignore the seriousness of the claim. The weight of the situation settled in the air, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Grace took a deep breath and steadied herself, refusing to let Evelyn's cruelty break her composure. "I haven't done anything wrong," Grace said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline coursing through her. She could feel the heat of the eyes on her, every pair of them piercing her skin like needles. But still, she stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. The manager, visibly uncomfortable, approached cautiously, glancing at Grace, then at the crowd of onlookers who were now whispering amongst themselves. "What seems to be the issue, Mrs. Davis?" the manager asked, her voice hesitant, clearly caught in the middle of this escalating confrontation. Evelyn snapped her fingers impatiently. "The issue, dear," she said, her tone dripping with disdain, "is that this girl has been acting suspiciously. She's obviously not here to buy anything. So I suggest you check her bag. I'm sure she's hiding something." Grace's heart sank further as Evelyn's words sank in. It wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was an accusation of theft, a public, humiliating claim that threatened to destroy her in front of everyone. She could feel her chest tightening, but she refused to let it show. She wouldn't give Evelyn the satisfaction of seeing her flinch, of seeing her react in a way that would validate this cruel attack. "I haven't done anything wrong," Grace repeated, her voice unwavering. She looked at the manager, trying to project calm, even though her insides were in turmoil. "But if it'll stop this nonsense, go ahead and check my bag." She reached into her purse and handed it over, her fingers stiff with humiliation. The manager hesitated, then took the bag from Grace, her hands shaking slightly as she began to inspect its contents. Grace held her breath, her mind swirling with the absurdity of the situation. She hadn't taken anything. She had been looking at dresses, nothing more. But here she was, being treated like a criminal. The minutes stretched on as the manager carefully went through the bag. Each second felt like an eternity, the murmurs from the other customers growing louder as they watched the scene unfold. Grace wanted to scream, to lash out at Evelyn, but she knew that would only make things worse. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on her, like 1,000 eyes burning into her skin. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the manager looked up, shaking her head. "There's nothing here," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she were ashamed to admit it. "There's nothing in the bag." But Evelyn wasn't satisfied. Her expression hardened, and she crossed her arms. "Check again," she demanded. She must have hidden it somewhere else. Her voice was now sharp, her words cutting through the air like daggers. Grace's patience was starting to wear thin. She had been more than cooperative, had allowed her bag to be searched without hesitation. But this was crossing a line. She clenched her fists, trying to keep her cool. Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm but firm. "I think we're done here," Grace said, her words carrying an authority that even surprised her. "Unless you have actual proof, I suggest you stop harassing me." Evelyn, though, wasn't backing down. She was determined to make Grace suffer, to make her feel small in front of everyone. "If you have nothing to hide," she sneered, her voice loud enough for everyone in the boutique to hear, "then why are you being so defensive?" Grace inhaled sharply, her hands trembling as she clenched them at her sides. Defensive? She had done nothing wrong. This wasn't defensiveness, this was self-respect. She stood there, her eyes locked on Evelyn's, refusing to back down. "You accused me of stealing without a shred of evidence," Grace said, her voice cutting through the tension. "That's not defensiveness. That's self-respect." The room was silent now, the murmurs from the other customers fading away as they took in Grace's words. The manager stood there, unsure of what to do. But the power in Grace's voice had begun to shift the dynamic. Evelyn, for all her arrogance and entitlement, seemed to falter, her confidence slipping for the first time. The manager, desperate to defuse the situation, spoke up. "Maybe we should all just take a step back and calm down," she suggested, her voice trembling with uncertainty. But Evelyn wasn't ready to let go of her accusations just yet. She pointed a finger at Grace. "Girls like her don't belong in stores like this," Evelyn said, her voice cold and cutting. "They come in, make a scene, and leave with things that don't belong to them." Grace's jaw tightened. She had heard these kinds of things before. But today was different. She wasn't going to let Evelyn's hate-filled words define her. "You're not just wrong," Grace said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You're showing everyone exactly who you are. And it's not a good look." The tension in the room thickened as Evelyn's words hung in the air. And Grace stood there, resolute and unyielding. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. But she refused to let it break her. The truth was on her side. And that would always be enough. But Evelyn, in her ignorance, continued. "We don't need troublemakers like her ruining this place," she said loudly, turning to the manager. "Just ask her to leave." The manager hesitated, glancing between Evelyn and Grace, unsure of what to do. Grace could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing her job, the fear of making the wrong choice. But as the manager finally spoke, Grace felt her stomach churn with disbelief. "I think it's best if you leave," the manager said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't want any more disruptions." Grace's heart sank. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. After everything, after being humiliated and accused, the manager was asking her to leave. This wasn't right. It wasn't fair. But Grace stood tall, her eyes steady, her resolve unshaken. "Are you asking me to leave?" she asked slowly, her voice thick with disbelief. "Even though I've done nothing wrong?" Evelyn smirked, her arms folded smugly. "Exactly," she said, her tone full of victory. "You're just proving my point." Grace turned to face her, her expression unwavering. "You're only doing this because of the color of my skin," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You should be ashamed of yourself." There was a brief pause as Evelyn looked taken aback, her confidence shaken by Grace's words. But before Evelyn could respond, the unmistakable roar of an engine outside interrupted the tension that had been building in the boutique. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, and the atmosphere shifted. Grace felt a flicker of hope stir inside her. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. The rumble of the engine outside the boutique echoed through the stillness, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. It was an unmistakable sound, powerful, commanding, and it broke the heavy tension that had settled over the space like a storm cloud. As the sleek black SUV came to a stop, its tinted windows gleamed under the soft afternoon sun, exuding an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. From inside the vehicle, a towering figure emerged first, a bodyguard, sharply dressed in a suit that matched the severity of his gaze. His eyes scanned the boutique with the precision of a hawk, taking in every detail of the surroundings. His mere presence seemed to alter the atmosphere, adding an undeniable weight to the air. The room fell into a hushed silence, the whispers from earlier dying down as the customers exchanged wary glances. The bodyguard stepped toward the boutique's entrance with purpose. But it wasn't him who commanded the most attention. Moments later, another figure emerged from the vehicle, David Anderson. David was a tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that fit him with an ease that spoke of both wealth and confidence. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the pavement, each step measured and deliberate, his presence unmistakable. As he walked toward the boutique, there was something undeniably authoritative in his stride, as though the very air parted to make way for him. The door to the boutique swung open with a soft chime. And the bodyguard entered first. His imposing frame adding an extra layer of gravity to the already tense atmosphere. The whispers that had filled the boutique a moment ago came to a halt. Evelyn's voice, which had been dripping with condescension moments before, faltered into an uneasy silence. Her sharp gaze followed David's movements, her brow furrowing in confusion as she tried to make sense of the situation. David's calm demeanor seemed to radiate authority as he moved through the boutique, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the scene with a sense of controlled intensity. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. His very presence had that power. The manager, who had been standing at a distance, visibly flustered and uncertain about what had just transpired, hurried toward him as he stepped inside. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her tone a mix of respect and nervousness. "We weren't expecting you today." Evelyn, still standing with an air of confusion and annoyance, muttered something under her breath. "Oh, another parent is here," she said dismissively. But before she could add anything else, David's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone steady but laced with an authority that made every person in the boutique stand at attention. His sharp gaze swept across the room, taking in the disarray, the flustered manager, and most importantly, his daughter standing at the center of it all. Evelyn, ever the opportunist, stepped forward, a thin smile forming on her lips. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "I'm glad someone's here to take charge of this mess. This girl has been causing trouble. I caught her acting suspiciously, she even tried to steal something." David's expression remained unchanged as he listened to Evelyn's accusations. His gaze turned briefly to the manager, who looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. The manager hesitated, clearly struggling with how to handle the situation. She glanced at Evelyn, then at Grace, before answering, her voice shaking slightly. "Well, Mrs. Davis did bring some concerns to my attention, but we checked her bag, and there was nothing in it." Evelyn's expression twisted with frustration, her tone growing more forceful. "That doesn't mean she wasn't planning to take something," she snapped. "People like her are good at hiding things." The words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Evelyn's blatant prejudice was now on full display for everyone to see. Grace, standing beside her father, could feel the anger rising in her chest. She wanted to scream at Evelyn, to demand why she had to bear this kind of treatment just for being who she was. But she held it in. Instead, she stood tall, her gaze unwavering. David's voice was calm, but his words were like a thunderclap. "People like her," he repeated, his tone neutral but laced with disdain. "You're going to have to do better than that." Evelyn faltered slightly, realizing too late that her words had been a step too far. She stammered in an attempt to backpedal. "You know what I mean," she said weakly, her voice cracking under the pressure. "This store is for respectable clients. And she clearly doesn't fit the profile." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as Evelyn's words echoed around the boutique. The other customers exchanged uneasy glances, and the manager stood awkwardly, unsure of how to proceed. But David, unwavering in his conviction, took a step toward Evelyn, his presence towering over her. His eyes narrowed, and his voice grew cold. "You know what?" he said, his tone cutting through the silence. "You're absolutely right. This store is for respectable clients. And you," he said, pointing directly at Evelyn, "are not one of them." Evelyn's face turned pale as the full weight of David's words hit her. She opened her mouth to protest, but nothing came out. Her usual confidence had crumbled in an instant, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. David wasn't finished. "This girl you're accusing," he said, his voice steady and measured, "is my daughter." The words seemed to freeze time in that moment. Gasps rippled through the boutique as the truth sank in. The manager's face flushed with embarrassment. And Evelyn's expression morphed from shock to disbelief. She had no idea who Grace was. No idea that she was standing in front of the daughter of the very man she had just tried to humiliate. The room was silent except for the sound of Evelyn's breath. Shallow and quick. David turned to the manager. His voice sharp and firm. "And you," he said. His gaze now directed at the manager. "Stood by and let this happen. Why didn't you question these baseless accusations? Why didn't you stand up for her?" The manager hung her head. Clearly ashamed. I didn't know," she muttered softly. "Not knowing isn't an excuse." David replied firmly, "It's your responsibility to treat every customer with respect and dignity. What happened here today is unacceptable. And it reflects poorly on this entire establishment." Evelyn, still reeling from the shock, tried to defend herself. I was just trying to protect the store's reputation," she stammered. But the damage was done. Her arrogance had evaporated, leaving only a sense of humiliation in its place. David didn't flinch. "Protect the store's reputation," he repeated coldly. "By targeting an innocent girl. By making false accusations. And by embarrassing yourself in front of everyone here?" He glanced at the other customers. Their expressions now filled with judgment, not toward Grace, but toward Evelyn. The boutique's atmosphere had shifted entirely. The customers, once unsure of how to react, now seemed to rally behind David's words. They had seen the truth, and they were no longer willing to remain passive. Evelyn, realizing there was no way out, tried to salvage whatever dignity she could. "I didn't mean any harm," she muttered under her breath. But the customers ignored her. David turned to the bodyguard. "Make sure she leaves," he instructed. His voice calm but final. The bodyguard nodded and stepped forward. Evelyn, her face turning red with shame, could only watch as the gravity of her actions sank in. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked toward the door, her heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. As the door swung shut behind her, the boutique was filled with an uneasy silence. But Grace stood there, beside her father, feeling a sense of triumph swell within her. She had stood up for herself, had held her ground in the face of hatred, and as her father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, she knew that the battle for respect and dignity wasn't over, but for today, she had won. As the door closed behind Evelyn, the tension in the boutique slowly dissolved, replaced by a profound sense of relief. The customers, who had once whispered in uncertainty, now exchanged glances of approval. Grace stood tall, her heart still pounding but with a sense of pride that she hadn't allowed herself to be crushed by prejudice. David's calm presence beside her was a silent affirmation that, in moments of injustice, standing firm and being true to yourself was the most powerful thing you could do. Grace had not only defended herself but had shown the world the importance of respect, dignity, and empathy. David turned to her with a soft smile, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. "You handled that with grace," he said, his voice filled with pride. Grace smiled back, knowing that this experience had changed her not just in how she saw the world, but in how she would fight for what was right in the future. As they walked toward the back office, leaving behind a room full of stunned onlookers, Grace couldn't help but wonder how many more Evelyns there were out there. But she was ready to stand up, speak out, and never let anyone make her feel small again. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more inspiring life stories.